Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I'm here with my buddy Teddy, who got a wonderful haircut today, as you can see. We had missed his last haircut while we were in New York because we got stuck for that extra week, so poor little boy has had to be extra fluffy this summer, and he was a trooper throughout, but now he is nice and trim again, and I think he loves it because he has been sassy all day. Anyway, we're here to do a Friday Reads video where we wrap up the week in reading and talk about any exciting bookish things that have gone on. Two things to note before we get into the Friday Reads. I finished 3 books this week. I did okay. And before we get to that, I have 2 things I want to talk about. So one of the things might be a little long. I'm going to try to keep it brief and short so we can get to the 3 books that I finished this week. But just in case, I will put a timestamp in the description box down below. So if you would like, you can skip to the Friday Reads portion of the video. The first thing I want to note is related to the shirt that I'm wearing. This is in honor of my dog, Jameson, who we lost and had to say goodbye to 2 years ago yesterday as I'm filming this. I'm filming this on Friday, so Thursday was the 2-year anniversary of saying goodbye, and this is in honor of her. So just wanted to note that, and Teddy is like falling asleep in the weirdest position. But anyway, so that's number 1. Okay, here's a super awkward cut because I talked for about a minute and then I got a phone call that I had to take, and Teddy jumped down and it was all a mess. So I'm going to try to start this over, but sorry for the awkward cut because suddenly Teddy's not here. We're just going to roll with it and keep going. The thing I wanted to talk about mainly before we get into the actual Friday Reads, and hopefully this is going to be sort of quick, is the fiasco that happened with the Polari Prize this year. And I think the most frustrating thing about it is that it was a series of unforced errors on the part of the Polari organization that led to them canceling this year's prize, or they said that we're going to put a pause on the prize and hopefully come back next year. If you are unfamiliar, the Polari Prize is a prize that has 2 different categories. I think it's only 2. They have a first novel prize, and then they added a category for best overall novel. And they are intended to recognize and uplift LGBTQ plus authors and stories and create a sort of inclusive community across all the spectrums of what it is to be a queer person, a queer writer, and the community that we create. And that really got challenged this year when John Boyne was included on the long list for the best overall novel for his book, Earth. And the reason that this is such a thing is that John Boyne is a self-described TERF. If you don't know that term, it stands for trans-exclusive radical feminist. It's what J.K. Rowling calls herself, or people have called J.K. Rowling and she now owns. And when John Boyne did say he is a TERF, he said, "I am a fellow TERF," writing in defense of J.K. Rowling. So that is the type of person that was included on this year's long list. He has been very unapologetic about his views about trans rights, and like J.K. Rowling, hides behind a noble intention of like, well, it's not that I'm transphobic. I like transgender people, but giving them rights makes a dangerous world for women. Things like that. And it's just really not great. And it's not the first time John Boyne has courted controversy. He wrote a book called The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and that is a book I have not read. I have heard pretty negative things about. But his book was criticized by the Auschwitz-Birkenau Holocaust Memorial Museum, and John Boyne does not take criticism well. I think that's another thing that's coming into play here, and it is something that I have seen in interviews and comments made from him and statements that he has made since. He does not enjoy being criticized, and he will not necessarily take in criticism. He will just push back and be like, well, I have a right to do this. And it's not great. And honestly, imagine pushing back and criticizing the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. It's not funny. I'm laughing because I'm uncomfortable at the very thought of doing something like that. But anyway, that's who John Boyne is. So when he was included on the long list, a lot of people were upset, understandably, because how can you be an organization that intends to support, recognize, uplift LGBTQ plus authors and be intersectional and supportive of all the whole vast community that we have, and one of the people that you are uplifting doesn't think that someone in that community should have rights? It's really not great. And it's hard for me to remember the exact order of things, but two judges ended up withdrawing, one of whom was Nicola Dinan, the author of Bellies, which I believe won the Polari Prize for first novel. This is a book that I recently brought into my library and would really like to read. And YouTube's own Bob the Bookerer. I'll link his channel down below. He dropped out as a judge. And I really admire him for making that decision and for backing down. Also, I really like his channel. So it's also an excuse for me to say, if you don't follow Bob the Booker, I love his Booker content and his weekly wrap-ups and all of that. So they dropped out, and I think about 20 authors ultimately ended up asking for their books to be removed from the long list in protest, not just in the best novel category, but in the first novel category. And then the Polari Prize, meanwhile, made it worse while this was happening, because they released a statement saying essentially, well, the judges who put that book on the long list didn't break any of the rules. And they kind of essentially said, well, there's nothing saying he can't be longlisted for the book, so we're just going to let it be. And they had also said, even within our community, we can at times hold radically different positions on substantive issues. This is one of those times. And that is a terrible statement, because yes, we can all hold radically different positions on substantive issues. But when someone doesn't think that another group of people deserve rights, what are you doing? What are you defending here? And it's just a whole gross situation. And we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I think that also just really just fanned the flames and upset a lot of people, myself included, to the point where ultimately then John Boyne released a statement, and then the Polari had to say that they were going to pause this year and come back next year after having done some work to inspect their rules for what qualifies and their processes and things like that, which, hopefully there will be follow through on all of those things. We'll get to what they promised later. First, I want to quickly cover what John Boyne said in his statement, which is a wild ride to me. So buckle up. He opens, for 6 years, since the publication of My Brother's Name is Jessica, I've been the focus of an extraordinary amount of bullying and intimidation, not just at the hands of trans activists, but also by a small group of toxic novelists. And this is something he has in common with J.K. Rowling again, where when you express a belief that a group of people does not deserve to have rights, and you get pushback on that, you portray yourself as the victim and talk about how you have been bullied, you have been wronged, you have been intimidated, and people should stand with you and not try to tear you down. And so he's doing that here. He goes on to repeat his belief that allowing trans women to have rights diminishes the rights that cisgender women, so giving trans women rights erodes the rights that cisgender women have been fighting for so long. It's nonsense. And then he says this: to the organizers and judges of the Polari Prize, thank you for standing strong in the face of extraordinary intimidation. To the writers who withdrew from the prize and those who organized petitions, I say this: you may have meant well. You may have thought you were doing an honorable thing, but you forgot one crucial fact: that the novelist you're protesting and the novel you tried to exclude is part of a sequence about sexual abuse from a gay man who endured that very trauma at school, was denied justice because my abuser died in the months leading up to the trial, and is still coping with not getting my day in court. And how do I cope? By writing books like Earth. He goes on from there, but we're going to leave the rest of it alone just to focus on that, which it's a difficult thing to talk about, because I in no way want to diminish the experience of people who have experienced sexual abuse or trauma because of sexual abuse. But first of all, he is again portraying himself as a victim in a circumstance where, like, he's being criticized for something where he is the one going on the offensive, but now that he is getting criticism for it and experiencing repercussions for the things that he has said, he is portraying himself as a victim. Because this has nothing to do with why people are protesting his inclusion on this long list. They're not protesting the content of his book or why he wrote it. They're protesting the beliefs that he puts forward and the activism that he's doing against trans rights. And honestly, not to be mean, I did end up reading Earth. It's a long story. I didn't know, essentially. But it's not a good book. I really thought it was harmful. Like, if I didn't know anything about John Boyne and I read the book Earth, I would have thought to myself, wow, this author hates gay men. So it's a weird book, in my opinion, to appear on a best of list that is intended to recognize LGBTQIA authors and books, because it doesn't feel like it's, I don't know. I did not like that book at all. But, you know, going back to this, and again, it's difficult to talk about because I don't want to diminish the experience, but what he's saying has nothing to do with what people are criticizing. And, you know, you can have experienced trauma, and that can be an awful thing that happened to you, but you can also still put energy out into the world that harms other people. Like, you can be someone who has survived something like this and also a racist, and you're still, you know, a victim who deserves some understanding on the one hand, but also the racism is still putting bad things out into the world and actively harming people. They are separate things. So he's using one to try to deflect the other, and it's just a weird thing to do. So the Polari Prize then paused, which I think is really the only thing they could have done after this series of unforced errors that they made. Because at this point, if they removed John Boyne from the long list, they would have gotten flack from John Boyne, who again has a history of not taking criticism well. So they would have taken flack from him. They would have J.K. Rowling would have been probably gotten involved. Anybody who is sort of on that side would have slammed the Polari for removing him from the list. And if they didn't remove him from the list, they would have continued to experience this backlash because they are not supporting a part of the community that they are supposed to be supporting. And then what happens if he makes the short list? If he doesn't make the short list, then he can criticize the organization. Again, like, they can get backlash from that side for not including him on the short list. And if he does, things get even worse for the people who are holding the Polari organization accountable for what they are doing as an organization that is supposed to be uplifting the LGBTQIA plus community. So it was a lose-lose situation. I think the only thing they could have done is just say, you know what, we're calling it a draw this year. We're just not going to do it, and we'll come back next year. So here is the statement that they released and what they are promising to do. What was supposed to be a celebration of exceptional LGBTQ plus literature has been overshadowed by hurt and anger, which has been painful and distressing for all concerned, and we apologize to everyone who has been affected. Many discussions have been undertaken over the last 2 weeks with authors, judges, stakeholders, and funders, and the impacts and ramifications of the long listing of John Boyne's novel and how we can learn from this experience and move forwards. We have decided as a result to pause the prize this year while we increase representation of trans and gender nonconforming judges on the panels for all the awards and undertake a governance and management review to include our aims and values and work to better support everyone within our LGBTQ plus Polari community. We have already secured strong representation for next year, which we will build on. We will also explore discussions about the tensions between the claims of freedom of expression and the need to create inclusive and supportive spaces in a world hostile to our trans community members and our community at large. And I do hope genuinely that there is a lot of follow-up on this. You know, there was a lot of criticism when the Academy, which oversees the Academy Awards, responded to criticism of the Oscars So White controversy by really expanding membership, but ultimately it has led to a much more interesting and diverse and Academy. And yes, there are still mistakes, like Green Book won Best Picture after they started expanding the membership, but you also got Parasite winning Best Picture the next year. And a movie like Everything Everywhere All at Once won Best Picture, which, you know, I feel like would have been excluded entirely from the Best Picture race just because of the type of movie that it is. So ultimately, decisions like that sort of expand the diversity of an organization, and if the Academy is any indication, it just leads to more interesting things happening. The Academy has also been a lot more international. Like this past year, you had I'm Still Here in major contention with Fernanda Torres getting a nomination for Best Actress. Like, it's more interesting. So I'm hoping that that is what the output of this will be. We'll have to wait and see what ends up happening with it. But what a mess. What a mess. And again, series of unforced errors on the Polari organization that led to this, which is all the more painful to have been watching from the sidelines. And what a thing to drop in the middle of this phase of Book Prize season as well, because, you know, we're waiting for the Booker Prize shortlist and all of that. So it's just been this wild fire on the side of the road that everybody's rubbernecking on. So that's the mess. I feel like this could have merited its own separate video, but I did want to at least try to talk about it a little bit. And it's difficult to distill a lot of the issues from this into a single video. So, you know, I don't think you can necessarily have a competent, in-depth conversation about what happened in just 15 minutes. But I wanted to talk about it, and because it is a shame what happened with the Polari this year, and how a prize that is supposed to be doing this noble and good thing really made a lot of mistakes and just made them worse. And hopefully they will start making them better going forward. So let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the video, because I finished 3 books, as I mentioned earlier, and there's a lot to talk about with some of them. I finished 2 of them this morning, so they're still pretty fresh in mind. But the first one I finished a couple of days ago. So let's start with that one, and then we'll go through chronologically in the order that I finished, as I usually do in Friday Reads videos. The first book I finished was Winging It With You. I don't know why I'm having a hard time talking today, but Winging It With You by Chip Pons. This is a gay romance novel, as you can probably tell. And in it, you have Asher and Theo. Asher has agreed to compete on a reality competition show that involves travel. I had previously described it as an Amazing Race style show. It's not really like that. So in Amazing Race, the traveling is part of the competition. And in this reality competition, you travel to different places in the world, but the studio will transport you to other countries, and then you will compete in a challenge once you get there. So that's the type of show. And Asher is doing it for his boyfriend, who has liked this show for a long time. They get to the airport to leave so they can go compete, and his boyfriend dumps him. And he decides, very spur of the moment, why don't I just go? I'm going to go. I'll do this without him. And now he needs to figure out what he's going to do, because he needs a partner. And he goes to the airport TGI Fridays, the bar in the airport TGI Fridays, and meets Theo, who is a pilot who is about to be grounded for a month because he hasn't taken vacation time, and his bosses really want to make sure he is prioritizing his mental health and well-being and taking care of himself. So, spur of the moment, Theo decides to go with Asher. But even I think I may have complained about this last week, but the way that goes down really doesn't make sense, because they flip a coin. And because Theo loses, he has to do Asher a favor. And before he knows what the favor is, he gets on a plane with Asher. And it's like, kind of like, I'm sorry. What? It's like, congratulations, you just got sex trafficked. What is going on? And so, but he goes, and on the plane, Asher tells him what's going on, and they end up competing. There's a very contrived thing where they have to enter into a fake dating scenario, because for some reason, even though Asher shows up with someone who is not his boyfriend, the producers are like, well, you're supposed to be competing with your boyfriend. So when we film, this needs to be your boyfriend. So they have to pretend to be dating while they are competing on this show. And of course, while they are doing that, sparks start to fly. Ultimately, it's just an okay book. It did scratch the itch I needed, where I needed some like cinnamon bun stuff. And it's not an entirely bad book, but there is some weird plotting, like the examples I've mentioned, like Theo just getting on a plane, not knowing where he's going or what he's going to be doing and what this person wants from him. That doesn't really work. It's one of the more you think about some of the plot twists and developments, the more it just all falls apart. And again, the whole notion that the producers would then, not only would they just let Theo onto the show when they would, without a background check or anything, that they would say to him, okay, well, we cast you and your boyfriend, so you need a boyfriend. And it's, anyway, if you roll with it, it's fine. But I really just thought it was an okay book. And actually, now that I think about it, I don't think I have much more than that to say about it. Being honest, I think I'm probably going to trade this in at my local used bookstore. But yeah, I think if you like gay romances, this might be for you. I thought it was strictly okay, because there are also interesting choices when it comes to the spicier scenes of the book, and I can't really talk about them without spoiling, so I'll just say I don't like it. Choices were made. I am not entirely on board with them, so we'll leave that one behind. Once I finished that, I went back to the pile of books that I have been sort of working off of, and I immediately reshelved the other gay romance that I had, because Winging It With You did scratch that itch that I had for a book like that, but also it kind of made me think I need something a little more serious. So I was looking at the other options that I had, and I went with The Road to Dalton by Shannon Bowring. And what's funny about that is somehow I really got the impression that this is a more cozy book, and it is not. And I was talking to Danny, that bookish bear, on Instagram, and he said, oh yeah, I've seen that book. What made you think it's cozy? And the only answer I had really was like, well, it has a colorful cover and the way the book is described, small town life, what it means to be alive in the world, the pain and joy, conflict and love, and the endurance that comes from living. And I don't know, I just somehow in my head thought that this was a cozy book, and it's not. It's a very serious book in a lot of ways, but I don't want to overplay the seriousness either. Just to say that I thought I was in for something cozy and a little fried green tomatoes-ish, although even fried green tomatoes has very serious sections in it. But this is more of a drama than a cozy book with quirky local townies. They're much more realistic people, and since realistic people are very complicated, the book is complicated. We are in the town of Dalton in Maine. You can guess that we're in Dalton, but it is interesting as well, because the way this is described, in the final weeks of 1989, a fender bender breaks the silence on an icy dark road outside Dalton, Maine, setting in motion events that will ripple throughout the town in ways no one can foresee. When the consequences of the accident play out, the community is left reeling. Lives are left bare, and we are reminded that no one is precisely who we think they are. And in the first 50 to 75, maybe even 100 pages of the book, I'd say 50 to 75 pages, you hear about the accident in the very first chapter, but it has already happened. And it seems like a relatively minor thing. So you don't actually, I kept thinking throughout the first 50 to 75 pages, it's really weird that they emphasize the accident so much, because it doesn't really seem to be much of an inciting incident. And then it's actually quite brilliant what Shannon Bowring does, because when it says setting in motion events that will ripple throughout the town in ways no one can foresee, you as a reader are sort of caught off guard by how much of an impact that accident has on the lives of the central people to this story. And that is incredibly well done. And it's really nice because the opening half of the book does a really great job introducing you to these characters, setting up the things that are going to happen. And then the second half of the book is a lot of reeling from what happens, but in a very beautiful and poignant way. And it's a very compelling book. And it is ultimately about community and trying to see people for who they are and understanding what they need. And also the idea that we might not really know what's going on in other people's lives. For instance, there's a point where a character sort of finds two girls who are by the side of the road in a car, and he's trying to figure out and understand what is happening. And at a certain point, he has to remark to himself, because he has misjudged the situation several times at this point, that maybe he just doesn't know what's going on in their lives. And maybe he shouldn't try to judge them without knowing anything like that. And I think that's a really great message. And I am really looking forward to reading the other two books in this series. There is one that has been published, which is called Where the Forest Meets the River, something like that. And there is another book that will be published in October, I believe. So I can't wait to see where some of these stories go, which lets you know I really enjoyed this book. And I will say, there are some storylines that don't feel like they have much of a payoff here, because what happens is none of it is really in the first person perspective, but you do specifically follow one character in each chapter. So in the first chapter, you follow a woman named Trudy to a New Year's Eve party, and then the next chapter might be from the perspective of her husband, and they sort of ricochet around these people. And there's a teenager who ends up working for Trudy in her garden, and his story, he has a storyline that is separate from what is going on. It ultimately doesn't really get closure, but I did look, and the description for the next book implies that there will be more story for him in the next one. It still means that in this volume, you don't get a lot of closure. You could convince yourself, like, well, I don't really know why that whole plot line is there. It doesn't actually it doesn't close up, and it doesn't really tie back into anything. But as part of an overall story, I'm willing to go along with that. And I trust Shannon Bowring, basically, after just one book. I really trust her to know what she's doing. And there's another storyline where someone, a couple that they have recently married, there's a big age difference, and the mother has made a decision about the situation, and then they come to the town, and it turns out she's misinterpreted things. And again, you get to that idea of, like, maybe you don't really know what's going on with other people, and you should allow yourself to get to know that first before you pass judgment. And their storyline also doesn't have a whole lot of closure, but they will also be back, I believe, in the second one. So again, I totally trust Shannon Bowring, and this is a case where I will absolutely go on this journey and see where it takes me, because I think this is a really beautiful, beautiful book, a very powerful book. There are big trigger warnings for this book. Depression is one, and I'd say go on Storygraph, look up the trigger warnings, because I feel like talking about the trigger warnings here might lead into spoiler territory, but I want to be mindful that there are things in this book that could be very difficult for a reader who has those trigger warnings. But if you can get past them, it's just a really beautiful book and intelligent, well written, and I can't wait to see where else this series goes. I don't know if there are going to be more than 3, but if there are more than 3, I would probably keep going, which is a dangerous thing to say without reading the second book, but I feel pretty convinced that that is what will end up happening. The third and final book that I finished this week was Dream State by Eric Pochner. What's interesting is I went to an author event that he did in Missoula last week, and the speaker there called him Eric Puchner, but the narrator of the audiobook calls him Eric Pochner. So I feel like I should go with Puchner, since he was there when somebody called him Eric Puchner. So I feel like he would have corrected them if it was wrong. But anyway, I ended up just okay on this book too. So if you're unfamiliar, this book, which has been blessed by Oprah, is about a romantic triangle, essentially. The first almost half of the book is set in the month leading up to a wedding. Cece is marrying Charlie. They live in LA, but Charlie's family has a cabin on a lake in Montana, a lake that is clearly inspired by Flathead Lake, which is a real place and gorgeous. And Cece adores this place, so they have decided they are going to get married there. And Cece goes a month early to wrap up a lot of loose ends for the wedding and try to make sure everything is going well and finalize some plans, while her husband has to wrap up, continue working back in LA. While she is there, she meets Garrett, who is her husband's best friend from college and who is going to be the officiant at their wedding. Garrett has experienced trauma in his life. Basically, the friend group that he and Charlie were part of in college included a man named Elias who died in a ski accident, and Garrett blames himself. Garrett had a lot of promise in his life, and he ended up dropping out of school over grief and tortured blaming of himself based on what happened. And now he has ended up living in Montana as a baggage handler at an airport. And he meets Cece, and he falls in love with Cece. And this leads Cece to be stuck in a situation where she has to sort of choose, like, is she going to continue and follow through with the wedding, or is she going to take a wild detour and go with Garrett? And her choice has ramifications over the next 40 years, 50 years actually, and ripples into the lives of the children of both sides of this romantic triangle. And the second half of the book skips ahead through the years, so you spend a lot of time at the wedding and then a lot of time sort of skimming your way through the next 50 years. And that was deliberate by Eric Puchner, because he talked about that, how he wanted to show how when you're young, time seems to stretch out, but as you get older, it seems to speed up. So he was kind of deliberately playing with the notion of time. And ultimately, I think one of the things I liked, or mostly liked, the first section of the book, where you have Cece and Garrett and Charlie, and ultimately the wedding is coming and a decision has to be made. And once you get to the other side of that, I started to feel disengaged from the book relatively quickly, because it starts to get kind of odd. I'm trying to talk about it without spoiling things for the second half of the book. But one of the things that I kind of don't like about this book is that the way it portrays marriage and love is a little bit cynical. Like, the marriage that Cece does enter into isn't necessarily happy. Sometimes there is disappointment. There is a lot of wondering about whether or not the right decision was made, if they attach themselves to the wrong person, and betrayal. And this is sort of set up as like, well, this is what marriage is. And as someone who likes the person that I'm married to, it just feels weird because that's not what it has to be at all. Like if I was in a marriage like that, I like to think I would probably leave and see if I could find better or do better. And it's like I said, it just seems sort of cynical about marriage as an institution. And that's interesting because when in the author event, Eric Puchner was saying like, well, I really wanted to write about marriage as it really is and how difficult it is. And it's just a lot of hard work. And then he laughed. And because I did notice a woman in the front row kind of cocked her head a little bit. And he said, my wife is here in the front row. And it's just interesting to me. And I didn't quite go along with that, especially since Cece in the first half of the book doesn't really make sense. I don't necessarily understand how she becomes conflicted between Charlie and Garrett. I don't think there's enough to show like that she would be tempted to throw away her life, the track that she's on, for Garrett, someone who she really doesn't like when they first meet. I don't see the tension that would cause her to face this impasse where she needs to make a decision. It doesn't make sense to me. It's one of those things you just kind of have to go along with, and then she makes a choice and you're like, okay, well, we're going to see how this goes. And also, it seems to be saying that the choice itself ultimately doesn't really matter, and I kind of disagree with that. I think a choice like that does matter, because that's not just how marriage is. The choice of who you marry doesn't matter if you think that marriage is always going to be a lot of hard work and disappointment and betrayal. If you don't accept that, then it matters who you choose to marry. There's also some really weird stuff that happens with the children on either side of this love triangle, and it tries to explain some of the odd stuff that happens by later on having to be like, oh, I was just being rebellious and wanting to shock people. But it's like, oh. And that is really at the point where I disengaged with the book. And once I disengaged from it, there was really no coming back. So by the end, I had sped up the audio to 1.5. I really don't like listening to a book that fast unless I'm trying to finish it quickly. And I was trying to finish this quickly at a certain point. So yeah, ultimately, I just thought it was okay. I think there are interesting things in here to talk about, but I also sort of struggle to recommend it, especially since it is a big time commitment. If you have read this, I would love to hear what you thought about it. Maybe avoid spoilers as much as possible in the description box or in the comment section, but am I missing something, essentially, is what I'm wondering. But I really felt disengaged from the book in the second half, and there was just no coming back from that. So those are the 3 books I've read. I am in the process of trying to decide what my next print book will be. I don't know yet, so that is something I'm going to be working on. And I also don't know what my next audio is going to be, because again, today I finished The Road to Dalton and Dream State this morning. So I will pick a print book probably by tomorrow morning, or if I haven't picked one tomorrow morning, I'll pick it in the morning. Just, cycle through the options that I have available to me and make a decision. I don't think I'm going to pick an audio until Monday, because what I have found is when the weekend comes, I don't make progress on an audiobook. So I think what I'm going to do is just lean into that this weekend, and then Monday, I also have a Libby hold that might be available by Monday. So if it is, I'll probably go with that. If it's not, I'll have to decide on something else. So I don't know what I'm going to be reading next, is the long and short of that. That's everything for this week. I'd love to hear what you've been up to, reading, watching, loving, all of that stuff. Let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.